There exists two people, those that love Final Fantasy IX, and those that don't love it yet. But give it time, they will. Part of being a longtime fan of this series is coming to terms with Final Fantasy IX being the perfect entry. What are the criteria people use to judge games? Presentation, how good does the game look? Combat, how fun are the battles? Music, is the soundtrack memorable? These are all important, but there exists a secret, hidden metric that's often ignored. It's not really something you can measure in an objective sense, it's more of a feeling, and that's charm. Once you factor charm into the equation, that's when you can finally understand why Final Fantasy IX works so well. That charm might not be obvious on a first playthrough, and that's why I said for some people, it takes time to appreciate this game. But once that charm starts shining through, and you catch a glimpse, you'll understand what sets Final Fantasy IX apart. With this in mind, I scoff whenever Square markets their newer titles as a great entry point for newcomers. I'm not sure if Square actually believes that. If I were a dev, of course I'd say my newest game is great for new players. I'm trying to get people to buy my product. The more people I appeal to, the greater the sales. But if Square were being honest, this game right here, Final Fantasy IX, would forever serve as the answer to the question, which Final Fantasy should I start with? But here's another question a newcomer might ask. Which version is the best? Well, depending on when you're watching this video, you might live in a world where a Final Fantasy IX remake exists. The modern gaming audience clamors for remakes of their childhood favorites, but I'll always advocate for the original vision, because it feels the most pure. No feature bloat, censorship, streamlined elements, modernized UI, and other tweaks that remasters and remakes include to justify their existence. Then again, I replayed this game with a mod that tweaks the combat, so how does that factor into the equation? That's a complicated subject to discuss, but at least for now, a remake isn't up for consideration. Instead, you have two choices, the PS1 original, or the remastered version that's based on the phone port. Nobody's considering the phone port itself, right? The PS1 version was the clear winner before Moguri mod release. This is a graphics overhaul mod that was created because Square was too lazy to upscale the backgrounds in their remastered release. Many people love it, I think it looks great, you can see how dramatically different the game looks thanks to this mod, but I don't use it. Call me a purist, but going back to charm, I fell in love with the PS1 visuals. For me, the best way to play is to emulate the PS1 version, upscale it to 1080p, downsample it, then throw on a quick and dirty CRT filter. The game looks stunning while still looking like a PS1 game. Which it is. I want it to look like a PS1 game. I don't want to pretend like it's something it's not. I think the Moguri mod is great for players that are after a clean, crisp visual style, but my preference aligns with the rustic charm of the PS1 version. There are two primary ways to tackle this game, the slow and steady way, or the Excalibur 2 way. When I started this channel, the second video I planned on making was an Excalibur 2 run. I wanted to try my hand at a challenge run because I typically don't play games that way. I game overed a little over an hour in without saving, so I switched to a different challenge run, Dark Souls Soul Level 1, which I think is much easier to complete. If you play the remastered version of FF9, you can toggle all those cheats like kill enemies in one hit, or turn off random battles, making the Excalibur 2 run easy and kind of invalidating the point of the playthrough. Attempting this with the PS1 version is much more challenging, because you need to understand how to route yourself through the entire game, and that's what makes this run so unique. It should be challenging. Final Fantasy IX is one of the only entries in this series that rewards mastery and knowledge of the entire game. Excalibur 2 being the most powerful sword is irrelevant if you're good enough to obtain it. It's a trophy. Kind of like Tournesol in Final Fantasy XII. Once you get the weapon, there's nothing left to do. But Excalibur 2 is an endgame subject. We've got a lot of ground to cover before we reach that point. This is my favorite opening sequence to any game. It's designed to put a smile on your face. Like Chrono Trigger, the intro is lighthearted and lets you roam around town and just take it easy, blissfully unaware that something big is brewing. This setup is why I vastly prefer Japanese RPGs. and why I've grown so disillusioned with the attempts to appeal to Western audiences with recent Final Fantasies. Western RPGs are typically more serious and depressing. Final Fantasy XVI is so oppressively depressing throughout its runtime that it feels like a radically different series. Forget the lack of RPG elements, the writers have a vendetta against these characters and want to torture them, and I don't understand why. This is not what Final Fantasy was like. I tend to let my emotions get the best of me when talking about this series. I focus on my dislike for the modern entries way too much. Can I really call myself a fan when I'm this negative? But at the same time, can you blame me? Final Fantasy XVI is almost unrecognizable as an entry in this series, with its action combat, single playable character, absence of elemental affinities, and limited customization. Change isn't inherently bad, but when people fell in love with this series decades ago and came to expect a specific style, and that style is radically overhauled to appeal to a different audience, is it unreasonable to have a bad attitude? This is why I'm content to replay the entries I love. I feel like most people don't replay games all that often anymore, opting to just focus on what's popular these days. I like playing new games as much as the next guy, but typically, I beat them once and then go back to my favorites like Final Fantasy IX. If all I played were new games, I wouldn't have the free time to replay the games I've loved for so many years. Going back to the intro, games find themselves in an advantageous position when compared to all other media. The player has an active role in the story. You don't need to be told what's happening, you're performing those actions yourself. The best games take advantage of what this medium offers and let the player experience these events firsthand, rather than through cutscenes and conversations. During this opening, you experience an event from three perspectives: a naive bystander, a brash kidnapper, and a loyal defender. You learn so much about these main characters within the span of an hour, and it's all done through role-playing. Sometimes RPGs forget the namesake of this genre, and don't realize that the best way to immerse a player is to let them fulfill a role. The game opens with Zidane, and he's thrust into a battle right away. There's no tutorial here, by the way, which should tell you that Zidane already knows how to fight. With later entries in this series like Final Fantasies X and XII, the character you start with is inexperienced in battle, which gives the game an excuse to teach the player the basics. Final Fantasy IX withholds the tutorial until you're a few hours deep, and it's optional when it does appear. By the time you reach the point where it becomes available, you don't really need it, which I view as proof that most games don't need tutorials. Basic controls don't require a tutorial, advanced concepts do. For example, you don't need a tutorial to teach you how to crouch in a shooter or talk to NPCs in an RPG. You'll figure those out naturally if you play the game for more than 5 seconds. That's not even an exaggeration. You know what needs a tutorial? A game like The Last Remnant, to show you which actions will cause a class to evolve, and which class it'll evolve into, which you will never figure out on your own. That's not to say a tutorial menu is worthless. It's nice to have as a refresher, but forced tutorials, especially lengthy ones, have no place in games. They become a nuisance during replays. If you don't replay games, you don't realize how obnoxious they can be. After the fight, the game wastes no time bringing you up to speed. You're tasked with kidnapping the princess under the guise of a traveling theater group. I've been critical of slow burns when it comes to RPGs, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that my favorites are all paced exceptionally well. You don't need to take things slow to get a player absorbed in your world. If your world is interesting, a player will naturally seek more information about it at his own pace. Final Fantasy IX respects the player enough to not smack him over the head with a slow, protracted tutorial. Before we learn more about this mission, the spotlight shifts to Vivi, who is immediately established as inexperienced and gullible. As he enters Alexandria, he stumbles with a little tripping animation and adjusts his hat before saying a word. One of the most charming aspects of this game are these animations. The world feels so alive when compared to every prior Final Fantasy. Even the pre-rendered environments have life in them, like these flags gently swaying in the breeze. Most players probably won't appreciate the little details, like these birds swooping in. When these things are static, like Wingull in the newer Pokemon games, players immediately take notice. It feels wrong. There's so much detail put into video games for the sake of immersion, that when just one thing feels off, it can ruin that immersive quality. Continuing with Vivi, he discovers that his ticket is a counterfeit, ignores the offer to jump rope because landing this 1,000 times in a row is used by the CIA as a form of torture, and helps the delinquent steal a ladder so he can sneak a view of the play. Contrasting this from Zidane's segment, which introduced the battle system, this portion introduces you to exploration and interaction, and it makes sense that Vivi's segment is the one that teaches you about this. Vivi's not a natural fighter, he's an inquisitive soul that's lost in this world. His design already paints him as a shy little guy hiding under an oversized hat, and his personality matches his appearance. The stylized design of these characters tell you so much more about their personalities than the realistic direction of Final Fantasy VIII's cast. I know people prefer realism in games, and the radical change in art direction of Final Fantasy IX turns some players off. I get it. I can't bring myself to play more than 5 minutes of Earthbound just because I can't get over the art style, which isn't fair to the game. Earthbound might be an incredible experience, but I wouldn't know because I don't enjoy the simple act of looking at it. When we switch back to Zidane, once again we're treated to action. We've already established him as a fighter after all. It'd be easy to simply watch a cutscene of this play, but this is a role-playing game, not a movie. You're not watching a mock battle, you're an active participant. When Zidane duels Blank, it's not a cutscene, it's a minigame where your performance is rewarded. What better way to get immersed in this world than to give the player meaningful decisions right away? Something interesting to note is how this play is told. The characters speak in a Shakespearean fashion because this is essentially a performance of Romeo and Juliet with names from King Lear. Baku plays a character named King Leo, which sounds similar to King Lear, and his daughter in this play is Cornelia, which sounds similar to Cordelia, King Lear's youngest daughter. Cornelia is also the name of the starting town in the first Final Fantasy, one of many references to past Final Fantasies that this game is overflowing with. I've gone on record saying I abhor the retranslation of Final Fantasy Tactics: The War of the Lions for making each character speak in Shakespearean English, and I stand by that. This manner of speaking is difficult to follow, but it works in 9 because this segment is brief, and you're literally partaking in a stage play. Presentation factors into how dialogue should be written. Final Fantasy IX's animations and camera angles suit this style of speaking better than the presentation used in Tactics. Overly expressive dialogue demands expressive animations, not motionless sprites, still cameras, and static character portraits. Final Fantasy IX also received radical overhauls during its localization, but in the opposite direction of War of the Lions. For example, in the Japanese script, when Zidane first meets Garnet, he describes her eyes in a very poetic way, like she's staring into the ocean. The localized version rewrites this scene so that Zidane behaves in a more believable way, but he still retains that sense of romanticism. There of course will be people that prefer one style over another, but the localizers were doing their job of writing for a different audience. It's easier for Western audiences to relate to a hero if he speaks normally. 25 years ago, people agreed that this method of localization was the way to go, but that's definitely not the case these days. The only real solution to this problem is to learn the original language and consume the native version of media. This is a difficult subject to cover and it's beyond the scope of this video, but I hope you can at least understand my preferences a little better. After the duel, we experience this moment from a third perspective, Steiner. Steiner's segment is my favorite because of how the audio design is handled. His theme perfectly captures his bumbling character. It has a cartoonishly bouncy feel to it, but the horns add a flair of nobility. But what really sells this moment is the sound of his armor clanking as he runs around. I can't even listen to this song in isolation without my mind adding the rustling metal. Just watching Steiner run around for a few minutes and listening to the audio is enough to tell you what kind of character this is. I also really like how you come across a knight named Mulenkidheim. I'm not sure if this is a reference to Mulenkamp from Vagrant Story, but I like to imagine it is, just because I've never heard of such an absurd name before. I love how this cast is introduced. You get severe whiplash playing this game coming off of Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII takes so much time easing you into the world, and the characters take so long to open up. You feel like you don't even know much about them until Disc 2. With Final Fantasy IX, owing to its more cartoonish and theatrical direction, the characters feel distinct as soon as they appear on screen. And while these segments are great when taken individually, that alone is not enough to make this my favorite intro in all of gaming. It's how these arcs are unified that makes this so special. The stage play is the anchor, and the entire cast gets wrapped up in a performance that still looks like a play to the audience, but is very real for the participants. Discovering the commonality that brings a ragtag group together is what makes the start of an RPG so exciting. I prefer when a group of characters have little in common, but a shared goal brings them together, and that's what kickstarts your journey. When the main party is already established as a group of friends, you typically don't see the kind of diverse cast that you get in games like Final Fantasy IX. You'll probably notice that the quality of the footage changes from this point on. I wasn't satisfied with the smoothed out image most emulators default to, so I tinkered with the settings to get the game to look just right. I don't like CRTs, and I refuse to spend hundreds on a bulky television that will sit in the corner untouched most of the time. I grew up with a CRT and I don't miss it one bit. The overscan meant that menus would be cut off if they were too close to the edges. You could adjust that to an extent, but try getting a kid to adjust his TV for every game. You picked a setting and lived with it. And people spend hundreds on upscaling boxes. It feels excessive. A filter on an emulator takes you 90% of the way there for free. Here's where you'll encounter your first active time event, which are mostly optional cutscenes that show what characters are up to. I love this feature because of how unobtrusive it is. If you'd rather preserve the pacing, you can skip them, which is amazing for replays and for an Excalibur 2 run. But what's magical about these active time events is how they let you step into another character's shoes. Once you wander into the forest, you can catch a glimpse of your traveling troupe performing Rufus's welcoming ceremony from Final Fantasy VII. I love when this series references past games, like a kid named Shinra traveling with the party in Final Fantasy X-2. What I don't like are the implications of this reference. It should be a fun nod, nothing more, but it could mean Final Fantasy X is a prequel to 7. And I don't want to think about that. A little later in Dali, you can see what Garnet, Steiner, and Vivi are up to as they wander around town. You haven't had a chance to breathe until this point, so it's nice to learn a bit more about your team. Even later, once you're in Treno, you can watch a series of scenes involving Garnet chasing down a thief. Once you catch up to the thief in real time as Steiner, you'll find out that he spent the stolen money on equipment, which he gives up. There are a couple of these events that lead to practical rewards, but the prize is just the cherry on top. I'm happy just to watch the scenes. Most of my favorite active time events are the humorous ones, like Vivi and Kuina getting married. I dislike minor character interactions and superfluous scenes in RPGs, which I know sounds contradictory. How can I love active time events, but also dislike scenes that don't push the narrative? And I'll admit, my tastes fluctuate by the day. One day I'll enjoy a slow-paced RPG, the next I'll vilify it. But what makes these scenes so entertaining is their brevity. These aren't like social links in Persona 5, where you watch dozens of one-sided conversations in a church, talking to a girl about how much she's obsessed with shogi. These can barely be considered conversations, they're more like therapy sessions.
Well then, that will be all for today.
In Final Fantasy IX, most of these last less than a minute, and that constraint forced the devs to create interactions that don't waste time. If you entered a town and were bombarded with 30 minutes worth of ATEs, I'd probably skip them. Instead, each interaction doesn't overstay its welcome, and some of these are missable, so you can stumble into new ones on a replay, which makes for a pleasant surprise. These active time events are a brilliant inclusion, and I don't know why Square never bothered to include a similar feature in later entries. I'm not a fan of how Square's treated Muggles over the years. I think giving them a voice was a big mistake.
I have a super duper amazing present for you.
And their design in Rebirth is hideous, but I think their portrayal in 9 is just about perfect. Square nailed their playful nature with some fun animations. Some Muggles hide in the environment, like this one taking shelter in a hollowed out tree stump. Later on you can free one hiding behind a rock wall. The animation work in this game does so much heavy lifting. Vivi tripping is always entertaining, and watching Zidane tease Steiner is classic slapstick, something I'd love to see more of across all games. These details highlight the importance of art style and expression. Art direction will always triumph over raw graphical fidelity. You don't need high-resolution models, lip-syncing, and motion-captured animations to create an immersive universe. I don't believe for a second that realism is what's best for this industry, but realism sure is easier to achieve than ever before. I still appreciate 2D animation in a world that's enamored with 3D. Metal Slug's animation remains more impressive than the overwhelming majority of 3D games, but it's not a lucrative investment of time, so it's not something we're likely to see again. Look at movies. Some of the most celebrated animated films of the past decade were 2D, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and Hayao Miyazaki's work over at Studio Ghibli. Once Miyazaki passes, do you think you'll find any director willing to dedicate an entire year to animate 4 seconds of footage? Even his son has forsaken traditional hand-drawn animation. Disney ditched 2D because 3D films make more money, and with the rise in AI, I doubt the situation will improve. AI can be a valuable tool to speed up workflow, but too many people are using it as an outright replacement for artists. Exploring dungeons is the best part of any adventure game, or at least I think so. Getting lost, stumbling into treasure, solving puzzles, fighting bosses, that's what I like. So when something like Namco's Tales series decides to uproot its dungeons and replace them with linear, transitory outdoor areas, bereft of puzzles, I start to lose interest in that series. I'm not interested in exploring empty hallways or wide open fields with nothing to do. The Pokemon series shifted its approach in a similar way. Do Scarlet and Violet have any proper dungeons? Does Legends Arceus? Seems like ever since this series made the leap to 3D, each release includes less dungeons than the last. Running around caves, ruins, towers, solving puzzles in gyms to reach the leader, infiltrating the bad guy's lair. I would have never guessed that Pokemon would eliminate all of this when I was playing Red as a kid. These fixed camera dungeons are what I miss most from RPGs. The widespread adoption of controllable cameras killed off this era of gaming. Gone are pre-rendered environments, treasures tucked out of view, and a reliance on puzzle solving. Most of this is absent from big-budget, mainstream RPGs. I'm left with no choice but to replay these PS1 and PS2 era games until Armageddon wipes us out, because modern companies don't want to make these games anymore. I don't think the issue is that players won't play them. I've seen plenty of people pick up these older Final Fantasies for the first time and fall in love with them. There's a market out there for fans of classic game design. Look at the indie scene. We're seeing a rise in popularity of Kingsfield clones, for God's sake. During my Excalibur 2 run, I died fighting the sea lion about an hour in, without saving. That proved that I wasn't ready to speedrun this game. This is a pretty tricky fight when you're rushing through because you probably won't have your trance bar filled. Limit breaks in Final Fantasy 7 and 8 were absurdly powerful, especially in 8 where you could perform them pretty much every turn. Final Fantasy 9 is an overcorrection, where you almost never pull off a limit break. You could grind to charge these meters before a boss, but that wastes a ton of time for a game that's not that difficult unless you're rushing through it, in which case you won't have the time to grind anyway. Trance exists mainly for story reasons, but its combat inclusion is a strong example of how storytelling can be incorporated in gameplay. In addition to the passive bar, there are predetermined points in the game where a character's emotional state peaks and they enter trance, when Vivi is fending off a Black Waltz, and when Steiner is defending Beatrix. You can experience these characters' adrenaline rushes firsthand, able to dish out extreme damage during a temporary time frame. It's a much better way to connect with a character than just showing me that they're excited during a cutscene, but during combat they act normally. This is an example of how showing creates a richer experience than telling, even if at the end of the day, trance still isn't that useful. If I manage to enter trance during a boss fight, great, but most of the time it'll be wasted during a random battle. Boss fights are no longer about killing them in one turn, they're about stealing rare drops. Enemies can have up to 4 slots of increasing rarity that you can steal items from, and most bosses have something worthwhile to steal. I'm not enough of a masochist to drag these fights out for the rare steals, but getting lucky and snagging a weapon that you can't purchase for a few hours feels so satisfying. Luck is an important factor in casual games. That randomized element means each run feels different, for better and worse. Monster Hunter used to embody this spirit perfectly. If you wanted a plate, you would never get it. But if you didn't want a plate, you'd be showered with them. But now with Wilds, every single monster is a piñata of plates and gems, and all that joy of getting rare loot is lost. In Dark Souls, I'm sure everyone's experienced this, but when you want the Baldur side sword to drop, you'd spend an hour farming for it. But on a strength or magic character, it'd drop immediately. I say casual games because arcade games, or anything competitive where you fight for a spot on a leaderboard, luck is infuriating. These games rely on execution and memorization. It's why players hated tripping in Smash Bros. Brawl. You feel cheated when an aspect beyond your control gives you a disadvantage. But when I'm playing a game for fun instead of sport, that unpredictability is very welcome. That's what lets each player have a unique experience. Without towns, this wouldn't be an RPG. Well, that and spending 30 minutes buying and equipping gear. You don't realize how much you like towns until they're taken from you. With Final Fantasy XIII, the series decided to skimp out on town exploration. 13 consolidates the entire town experience into save points, where you can buy items and upgrade weapons, but it makes the world feel so lifeless. Maybe that's the approach the director was going for, but it's about as far removed from Final Fantasy as you could possibly get. 15 took the open world approach and brought back towns, but most felt like checkpoints instead of proper settlements. There are a handful of memorable cities, but nothing iconic like Midgar or Alexandria. To give 15 some credit here, the city themes are exceptional. I feel like I go on about music way too much, but it's an important part of the experience. It's something I can enjoy even when I'm not playing the game, or when I'm playing something else. I've been replaying Metal Gear Solid 5 lately, and that game supports custom soundtracks. I couldn't think of anything more fitting than slotting in some Final Fantasy music to accentuate the action. I'd love nothing more than to share my favorite tracks for this series, but finding ones that YouTube doesn't copyright flag is like navigating a minefield and using your bare hand as a metal detector. Depending on who holds the copyright, the entire video can be blocked from a country just for playing a few seconds of music. Sony Music is especially nasty about this, blocking videos from Russia if they contain music published under any of their labels. Square Enix doesn't go that far, but the tracks to get flagged seem random. Yoko Shimomura and Nobuo Uematsu are the two whose music gets caught the most, which is a shame because they're both stellar composers, some of the best in the industry. Picking a favorite soundtrack from the PS1 era is an impossible task. Final Fantasies 7 through 9 plus Tactics are peerless. I didn't give 9 enough credit for the longest time because it's been years since I completed a run, but I forgot how many wonderful tracks there are. Most of the music reminds me of a Renaissance fair. When Uematsu composes, he doesn't just go for ambiance, he tries to create catchy songs that you can hum or tap your feet to. And this makes sense when you read his interviews and learn that he's inspired not by classical composers, but by rock musicians like Jimi Hendrix. It's a recurring element of this series to have oddball, non-human characters join your team. Final Fantasy VI has Umaro and Mog, 7 has Cait Sith, 10 has Kimahri, 12 has Fran, and 9 has pretty much the entire cast. That makes it rather unique in a way. Everyone looks and behaves radically different, really feels like a ragtag bunch joining together on an adventure. Too many entries miss out on that adventurous feel by having characters be related in some way. In 8, they belong to the same military academy, same with Type 0. In 15, it's a prince and his escorts. In 16, it's a one-man show. I love wandering out into the world and stumbling into a quirky character that joins your team. That's another aspect of RPG design that feels lacking these days. Lindblum is where you'll find the first synthesis shop. This feels like a half-baked feature for most of the game. It mainly exists to let you recycle outdated gear, and in that respect, I really like it. Having useless gear clutter your inventory is something most RPGs don't address. Final Fantasy IX tries to make gear serve a lasting purpose by imparting skills, but they'll eventually become useless all the same. Synthesis lets you turn this used up gear into items that carry brand new skills, but it doesn't go far enough. There aren't that many items to create throughout the first 2 discs, and that's because you don't even have a choice in team composition until the very end of disc 2. Party usage is something I see so many RPGs fail to address. What typically happens in RPGs where you can create a team is someone will join you and you're never forced to use them. So if they don't make the cut for your lineup, they get benched and stay benched for the rest of the game. Persona is especially bad about this. I typically stick with the first 4 characters throughout the entire game since I'm already familiar with their performance, and the game rarely forces you to change your team. So everyone that joins after the fact, especially if they join 30 hours down the line, doesn't feel like a contributing member. Their role in my adventure feels next to useless. Final Fantasy is guilty of this too. Final Fantasy XII gives you your full team early on, and they never split up. Before the international version released, that meant you had no reason to use more than 3 characters. I still love the game, but I wish there were incentives to switch up your team, like the final dungeons of Final Fantasy VI and VIII. Final Fantasy IX makes sure you don't get too comfy with anyone by constantly switching members around. If you really like Freya, you've got to keep playing until she rejoins you. By the time you get the full team, you've already become familiar with everyone, making your decision on a final lineup more difficult. While you wander around Lindblum, you'll come to a hideout where there exist 3 chests containing random amounts of gil. But is it really random? One chest contains 68 gil, 197, and the last contains 282. This is a coded reference to Zidane's flirtatious personality, and to decipher that code, we've got to talk about Will Smith. 68, aka 1968, the year Will Smith was born. 97, 1997, the year Big Willie Style released. 282, that kinda sounds like 2 and 2. That's a lot of 2s. Now which song on this album makes prominent usage of the number 2? Just the 2 of us. We can interpret this cover of Grover Washington Jr.'s 1980 classic as Zidane's theme song, but not just that, every song on this album can be connected to a Final Fantasy game. Men in Black is a reference to the hooded Sephiroth clones in Final Fantasy VII, whose arms are branded with seemingly random numbers, similar to the seemingly random amounts of gil you find throughout the world of Final Fantasy IX. That's a whole separate discussion right there. Miami has obvious parallels to the tropical setting of Spira in Final Fantasy X. Just cruising can be connected to how you traverse the world of Final Fantasy XV in a car, listening to classic tunes from the series. Chasing Forever is how long Square plans on milking Final Fantasy XIV with expansions. You could very well consider Big Willie Style to be a celebratory soundtrack for the entire series. These chests refill with gil at several points throughout the game, and we'll cover their references to Will Smith at the end of the video, but for now, we're moving on. The Festival of the Hunt is this game's version of a timer-based event, similar to the Fire Cave exam and Escape from Dali in Final Fantasy VIII, and the Mako Reactor 1 bombing in Final Fantasy VII. These tend to be the more memorable parts of games because they put pressure on the player to play efficiently. I like how Final Fantasy IX's time segment is competitive in nature, rather than a race against death. Instead of running from enemies to end the section quickly, you're engaging with as many as possible to secure a high score. That makes this section feel more unique amongst the PS1 Final Fantasies. The one downside to this event is that Zidane's reward for winning feels inferior to Freya's prize. If you want to play this game optimally, getting the Coral Ring here allows Freya to learn Lancet, plus the ring absorbs Thunder, which helps if you want to grind against Grand Dragons on Disc 1. This isn't really much of a complaint since the Coral Ring isn't a unique item, but it does influence how you progress through the next section. Speaking of the next few hours, at this point your party branches for a significant portion of the game. I love this moment because you lose your White Mage for the remainder of Disc 1, forcing you to rely on an alternative means to heal. Growing complacent with a formula that wins every fight is an issue that leads to boredom. I've dropped more RPGs than I can count at around the 10 to 15 hour mark because the tedium gets to me. Forcing the player to consider new strategies, either through gimmick bosses or party handicaps, goes a long way towards preventing that tedium. Without Garnet around to keep you topped off, you need to rely on items or Kuina to get through the upcoming dungeons. Pronouncing the names of characters and places in this game is pretty tricky since most of it is directly translated from Japanese, which has easier rules for pronunciation than English. This character's name is unambiguously Kuina in Japanese, but in English, Quina, Kina, there are no rules when pronouncing proper nouns, and to my knowledge, we've never had a Square Enix game where this character's name is audibly spoken. So, let's infer. This race is spelled Q-U. Following English grammar rules, most people would probably pronounce this as Ku. Since each member of this race uses the letters Q and U in their name, I think it's fair to assume we can use that same pronunciation for their names. So, it's Kuina, Kuail, and Kuan, which, unsurprisingly, are similar to their Japanese names. Kuina is an optional party member at this point, but it's well worth picking him or her up unless you're speedrunning. For simplicity's sake, I'm gonna refer to Kuina as a dude. He's a blue mage, and this is one of those love it or hate it classes. I tend to ignore blue mages because it takes considerably more effort to acquire their skills than any other character. Blue magic usually consists of bizarre, situationally dependent spells, like Pumpkinhead and Roulette, that you'll almost never use. These skills pad out the list and make blue mages seem more versatile than they really are. What really stings with blue magic is the MP cost for the best spells. You can learn Mighty Guard immediately, but the MP cost is so prohibitively expensive that you don't really want to use it until much later on, when you learn half MP. If you play Kuina casually, without understanding how to build him, he's one of the most underwhelming party members. His weapon hits for an extremely wide range of damage, and most of his blue magic spells are finicky. Sure, there are places where stuff like level 5 death cleans up, but you probably won't figure that out on a casual playthrough. Blue mages are for the more advanced players that know the game inside and out and can abuse the spells to trivialize encounters. Once you know the tricks, Kuina is extremely useful and arguably the most powerful character, or at least the easiest to break the game with. He's the first to hit the damage cap thanks to Limit Glove, and he learns White Wind almost immediately, patching that white mage hole in your team. He's also got a few tricks up his sleeve with inflicting status effects and draining MP from magic-focused bosses. I made an effort to use him on this playthrough more than I usually do, just to see if I could come around to appreciating blue magic. I didn't, but as a character, Kuina became one of my favorites. He has some of the funniest lines in the game, and I can't help but admire how he bumbles from town to town at his own pace, repeatedly crossing paths with Zidane by sheer happenstance. He's a unique take on the comic relief character in that he doesn't feel forced. Kuina plays to the beat of his own drum, rather than surgically attaching himself to the hero's ass cheeks. That gives him a sort of innocent charm that helps him break the mold from this otherwise stereotypical character. There's a well-known trick you can perform here with Kuina to power level your team. Since the very first Final Fantasy, there have existed tricks and exploits that let you drastically lower the difficulty. In Final Fantasy I, there was a programming oversight that let you encounter late-game monsters in an early portion of the overworld. People called this area the Peninsula of Power. In Final Fantasy IX, you can fight late-game enemies here called Grand Dragons. With a proper setup, Kuina can smack the dragons for the damage cap, then eat them, ending the battle in 2 turns. Last year I trivialized Final Fantasy VIII by abusing its junctioning system to kill almost every boss with a single limit break. While that was amusing, I didn't want to ruin the progression of Final Fantasy IX. This playthrough is played mostly straight, without using abusive abilities like auto-regen. Auto-regen is absurdly powerful because of the changes to the ATB system. The way ATB works in Final Fantasy IX is that meters continue to fill during animations. Time doesn't freeze, and because regen ticks occur in real time, you'll continue to heal while you wait for those animations to finish. For example, you can regenerate huge chunks of health while a summon animation is playing. You can't unlock auto-regen until the end of Disc 2, so it's not something that ruins the entire game, but it is very easy to abuse. While I'm on the subject of ATB, the way it's incorporated here comes with some quirks. Because time doesn't pause, and characters can't attack simultaneously, what happens is actions get put into a queue. This causes battles to feel a bit sluggish at times, where you'll assign an action and wait several seconds before it goes off. Sometimes you'll time an attack during another character's animation, but the enemy also snuck an action into the queue. So once the next turn comes, the enemy attacks, and your character with a queued action is still waiting for his turn, while everyone else is already charging their meters. I appreciate this queue system for being different, but I love playing these turn-based Final Fantasies on active mode, and the way ATB works here feels more like wait mode. Battles aren't fast-paced because so much time is wasted waiting for your actions to go off. There's not a lot of strategic consideration involved with timing your attacks if they just get slotted into a queue. Not to mention the speed stat doesn't matter if you're just gonna have your actions thrown into a pile anyway. And if speed doesn't matter, neither does the haste spell. Leave it to modders, who are some of the coolest members of the entire gaming industry, to adjust and rebalance games and make them more engaging. There's a fantastic patch by Rosso Dude called Comprehensive ATB Enhancement that I used for this playthrough. It speeds up ATB charge times and pauses the timers during animations, which lets you time your actions with much greater flexibility. The frame rate was also raised by 5 frames to quicken these animations, which means each encounter feels so much snappier. Apparently this patched ROM can also run on original hardware, which means Square could have ran the game at a higher frame rate, but chose not to. For anyone interested in emulating the PS1 version these days, I can't recommend this mod enough. Why does rain make everything better? It seems like if you want instant atmosphere, you just add rain and it works every time. Might as well have every game take place during a torrential downpour. You wouldn't hear me complaining. Kuina can snag Angel Snack here, which is one of his best spells because Final Fantasy IX is a game rife with nasty status effects. The random enemies frequently sling them your way, to the point where Kuina's party-wide remedy becomes very valuable. I'm not sure which method of dealing with negative status effects is optimal, curing them with Angel Snack, or preventing them entirely. If you memorize the game and know when you'll encounter specific ailments, you can equip abilities that defend against them, assuming you had the foresight to acquire the items that teach those skills. For a casual player, most of these status immunity skills aren't worth the AP to keep active at all times, so it's easier to use items or Angel Snack to cure the ailments as they come. Final Fantasy XII handled this situation better with the Gambit system. You can create a Cleric or White Mage loadout that cures status ailments automatically. There's no catch-all Gambit, you need to specify which ailment triggers which action, but it feels smoother than teaching each individual character the appropriate warding ability, then equipping and unequipping it as the situation demands. Don't think I've ever seen a Final Fantasy handle status effects well. Most of the time, it's just matching an item to the negative ailment and you're done. Rarely do you need to live while under that effect and shift your strategy, which would have made status effects meaningful. But because most players view them as annoyances, you just use items or Isuna to cure the status instantly. Strangely enough, the Pokemon series has my favorite implementation of status effects, since most are permanent and significantly affect your battle prowess. When you receive these ailments, it's a minor annoyance. When you inflict them, it either trivializes the fight or it doesn't work. The best status effects, like sleep or stop, are so powerful that you usually can't inflict them on bosses, and using them against random encounters is unnecessary. In the Super Nintendo version of Final Fantasy VI, there exists an exploit people dubbed Vanish Doom. If you inflict the invisible status on a boss, the Doom spell will bypass their immunity and instantly kill them. Square doesn't want to create a broken scenario like that again, which might be why they're afraid to experiment with status effects, though nowadays it's nothing a patch couldn't fix. Disc 1 ends on a rather anticlimactic note with the fight against Beatrix. Final Fantasy VII had you squaring off against Genova, and 8 pit you against Edea, both villains that were established well beforehand. Beatrix doesn't get that build up, and during the battle, you don't even get the satisfaction of besting her. After 10 turns pass or you inflict enough damage, she drops everyone to 1 HP. This type of forced loss was first introduced in Final Fantasy II. At the start of the game, you encounter 4 Black Knights that wipe your team. This was meant to demonstrate how weak you were at the beginning of your journey, and how you stand little chance of besting the villains. This is an effective way to tell a story through gameplay, but it has diminishing returns, and can feel frustrating if used past the intro. For story purposes, it's still a memorable fight. Beatrix is clearly toying with you, if she's capable of dropping everyone to 1 health with a single attack. Better to experience this in a battle rather than a cutscene, and your subsequent encounters with her play out the same way. Clearly she's out of your league, and you'd expect to eventually grow powerful enough to beat her. That doesn't happen. You're denied that final confrontation because she switches sides. During the few sections where you can control Beatrix, she doesn't feel measurably stronger than your other party members, which makes her I win button she repeatedly uses to end her boss fights feel cheap. In Final Fantasy X, when Seymour joins you against Sinspawn Gui, his higher level magic quickly kills the boss. This is an important contrast from the first phase of the fight, where you don't have Seymour and are faced with a more difficult battle. It establishes him as a powerful mage, which you'll be on the receiving end of during his boss fights. Still, Beatrix is a charming character that has a small but memorable arc throughout Disc 2, which, coincidentally, starts now. Final Fantasy IX is one of those rare RPGs where I like every party member. Part of that is due to their unique designs. Each one stands out instantly because of the heavily stylized art direction. Another is because they have specialized roles in battle. Any Final Fantasy with a job system largely erases character identities. But their personalities are what I find most appealing. Watching these characters grow throughout the journey makes the adventure feel worthwhile. Garnet leaves her life of isolation and slowly adopts a more casual speaking manner as she learns more about the world. Vivi comes to accept his fate and makes the most of his short lifespan. Almost all of these characters have memorable arcs. Talking about games at great length has helped me better understand my own tastes. Have you ever played a game and disliked it, but couldn't put your finger on what exactly the issue was? You just weren't feeling it? By going through a game beat by beat, you start to pick up on the things you love and hate. I really love the lighthearted scenes in Final Fantasy IX, and their frequency is why I never got bored of the story. Humor and action are what I love, not so much romance, drama, and depression. Even though Final Fantasy IX tackles heavy subject matters, it does so elegantly, never dragging you down into a pit of depression. I'm not a fan of mopey characters that barely speak above a whisper, like Clive in Final Fantasy XVI. I don't like the party member drama that plagues Final Fantasy XIII. I don't want the lead to be an introvert like Noctis from 15, or Squall from 8. Modern Final Fantasies are missing so much of that humor that used to be ubiquitous in this series. They take themselves so seriously. They have depressing endings that leave you feeling deflated. I play RPGs to feel good, not depressed. Happy endings may be cliche, but they're cliche for a reason. I really resonate with them. I like bright characters and the fun, adventurous feel. Same for movies. I love 80s adventure films like Romancing the Stone and Back to the Future. That used to be the style of story you could expect from this series. Even in Final Fantasy VI, once the world is destroyed, that sense of adventure is preserved. I droned on about Disc 1 for a while, but the rest of this will go by much quicker. This won't be a 2-hour video. I'm gonna gloss over the first visit to Treno because we need to cover it in Disc 3 anyhow. We do get a scene with Kuja here, and it's easy to view him as a weak villain for a while since he spends so much of his time scheming behind the scenes. Strong villains make for strong stories, and while Final Fantasy IX has memorable antagonists, at no point are you afforded the satisfaction of besting any of them. I think this is intentional, since each villain has some redeeming quality. I think the design of Kuja holds him back from being a more threatening figure. It's just hard to take this guy seriously when he's dressed in a fruity showgirl outfit that exposes his midriff and inner thighs. Look at the villains from the earlier Final Fantasies. Garland, Golbez, Exdeath. They all had thick, burly armor. They exhibited the aura of powerful antagonists. I really dislike the appearance of the more feminine-looking villains like Emperor Mateus, Kuja, and Seymour. Especially Seymour. They just seem so easy to bully. Kefka is probably the only exception because clowns are innately creepy. Plus he hams up the insanity better than any other character in this series. But Kuja has a fascinating arc. Sure, he's ultimately another dude that wants to blow up the world, nothing we haven't seen before, but his motivation feels unique. He has a doomed existence and doesn't think to destroy the planet until he's told he has an expiration date. He spends most of the game trying to justify his existence and prove to his creator that he's not inferior to his replacement. I can sympathize with him just a little bit, unlike Ultimecia, who wants to escape death by killing the people that are destined to kill her. And the only reason they want to kill her is because she wants to kill them, turning the entire premise into an infinite loop. Or Sephiroth, who either has a mental collapse when he realizes he's not that special and somehow decides the best course of action is to destroy the planet, or is being manipulated by Jenova into blowing up the planet because Jenova is a crazy alien that wants to destroy planets for some reason. The original game didn't make this point clear, but the sequels prove that Sephiroth is just crazy, ruining the mystique of his original appearance. Or Kefka, who wants to blow up the planet and rule as god because an experiment caused him to go insane, and this is explained in a throwaway line by a random NPC. Kuja has a bit more depth than we were accustomed to by the villains in this series, and he's sent off in a graceful way during the ending. He's not the best villain in the series, but I do like him overall. Owing to your smaller party, Garganru is an extremely brief dungeon. It's probably not even worth calling it that, but it does house a boss. It feels weird calling a party of 3 small since that's the limit of Final Fantasy 7, 8, 10, 12, and 13. But for the longest time, the 4-man team was the norm. Final Fantasy IV, the first with ATB, had a 5-man team. These extra party members make ATB combat so much more exciting, since you're juggling more actions during each battle. The return to the 4-man team in Final Fantasy IX is yet another throwback to the classic era of this series, and it's a welcome return. Party members have been treated with less relevance from Final Fantasy XI onward. The MMO entries are all about you. Final Fantasy XII rarely incentivizes you to manually control your teammates since their gambits put in most of the work. Final Fantasy XIII doesn't let you control anyone but the lead, and the same goes for the original release of 15. You could only control Noctis, and Final Fantasy XVI just ditches the party aspect entirely. I never thought the mere presence of controllable party members is something I'd take for granted. It's hard to believe a city exists within an F5 tornado, but not quite as hard to believe as the party waltzing into it without any sort of protective eyewear. I've been caught in haboobs, which are huge dust storms that occur in deserts, and it's hard enough to breathe in these comparatively weak storms. Visibility drops to about 1 foot when you're caught in one of these while on the road. You'd think this storm would make Cleyra unapproachable. How is Zidane team able to enter, but the Alexandrian army can't until the storm dissipates? Cleyra's trunk is a straightforward dungeon, but it's a bit meatier than the past few. The fixed camera lets the devs hide a great deal of treasure chests. Some are tucked behind objects, but others are out of reach, and the puzzle comes from figuring out how to reach them. With the popularity of controllable cameras, this type of level design has become nearly extinct. The hunting aspect of treasure hunting rarely exists in modern RPGs. Even though most of these dungeons are easy to navigate, the treasure chests serve as encouragement to scrounge for secret paths. When people complained that Final Fantasy XIII was overly linear, it's because it was missing this type of level design. Final Fantasy XIII's approach to level design is drawing a stem with thorns and sticking treasure spears at the tips. The treasure locations are always obvious and never difficult to reach. This lazy approach to level design feels insulting, almost as if the devs were aware that without treasure or branching paths, a dungeon isn't a dungeon, it's a conveyor belt. This band-aid fix doesn't address the issue. It's a blatant patch job. Dungeon diving is my favorite part of RPGs, and I don't think I'm alone on this. I don't consider the Zelda series to be RPGs, but in a similar vein, people love the series because of the dungeons. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom marked a change in dungeon design, and for many fans, it was a change for the worse. I have a semi-controversial opinion in that I dislike Majora's Mask because it only has 4 dungeons, with the majority of content consisting of side quests. If the side quests and overworld activities were replaced by a few more dungeons, I'd enjoy the game much more. You'll frequently see the sentiment that Final Fantasy died at 10. I don't agree with that consensus because I love Final Fantasy XII, but if we're talking about that classic feel, then the series ended at 9. Long-running series like Final Fantasy and The Legend of Zelda try to refresh their newest entries to appeal to wider audiences, but they risk alienating the fans that made these games so successful. This is what makes discussing these series so difficult. You've got newer fans praising the recent entries and clamoring for more, while the older fans either accept that their series is steadily becoming unrecognizable, or they move on. I'm caught in the middle, holding out hope that the magic will someday return, but frequently becoming disappointed, and I really have no one to blame but myself. What I find amusing is that Final Fantasy had an established identity for the first 10 entries, and because of a fear of growing tired and stale, it tried searching for a new identity, and it's still searching almost 25 years later. Square can't decide if this series is an MMO, single player, extremely linear, open world, turn-based, action-focused, has party members, and everything in between. These vastly different entries have radicalized the fanbase, where now you've got die-hard supporters of one entry that vehemently hate others. There was never this type of animosity amongst the fanbase 25 years ago. If you liked Final Fantasy IX, you liked every entry. After controlling 2 teams for the past few hours, it's refreshing to have the party reunited, though the refreshment is short-lived. We've got another race against the clock. Well, it's hard to classify this as a race. I imagine you get a game over if the time expires, but I'm not sure if that's possible unless you attempt the optional boss, which I saved for the revisit. It's a gimmick boss that requires magic to deal any sort of meaningful damage, so it's better to wait until Vivi gets some stronger spells. I've grown a greater appreciation for gimmicks and boss fights and dungeons. When I was younger, these restrictions were annoying because they prevented me from playing my way. Now with hundreds of RPGs under my belt, I understand that these gimmicks are what keep the journey fresh throughout the lengthy runtime. Using the same strategy over and again creates tedium, and there's only so much tedium I can take before I give up. Gimmicks keep you on your toes, preventing you from becoming complacent. There's a dungeon much later where you can't cast magic, and you need to settle on a team before you enter, which means you might be using characters you've been neglecting. Then the party you left behind needs to progress through a separate dungeon. I love the variety, and I praise the bosses in Final Fantasy XII for employing similar gimmicks like banning magic or technics. This is the part where Beatrix has a change of heart and you fight alongside her for a few battles. I've seen plenty of fans wish for Beatrix to be a permanent party member, and there are mods that keep her around, but I never wanted Beatrix to be part of the main team. For one, she led an army to destroy Burmecia and Cleyra, so she shouldn't be joining us to save the world. She should be hung. Second, Steiner already fulfills the knight role. We don't need another. I get it. She has an eye patch, huge tits, and kicks the shit out of everyone. That's the dream girl right there. That's why people want her and not the other guest characters like Blank and Senna. But she doesn't really fit as part of the squad. While the melee fighters hold the line, the pacing slows down a bit so we can play hide and seek with Ramuh. This segment has you gathering pieces of a short story to unlock your first summon. Prior to this point, Garnet had innate summons, but she couldn't cast them because of their inflated MP costs. This is similar to Tella and the Meteor spell in Final Fantasy IV. He knows the spell, but he can't cast it because it costs 99 MP, and his MP is capped at 90. It exists for story reasons. When he finally does cast Meteor, it costs him his life. These subtle gameplay ties to story are always fascinating to reflect on when you replay a game. Video games are an interactive medium, and many developers seem to ignore that aspect when it comes to storytelling, opting to consolidate most of the narrative elements into cutscenes. I've been very critical of From Software's games, but one thing they seem to understand very well is how to fuse story with gameplay. When you pick up a sword, it comes bundled with a brief description of the item, who wielded it, and which feats he was known for. If you look around the environment, you might be able to paint a picture of how that sword's owner met his end. This environmental storytelling feels more compelling than a cutscene, because it's up to the player to stitch the pieces together. With pre-rendered backgrounds, creating an interactive world is much more difficult. Oftentimes the world reacts off-screen. When you smash a cage into a mezzanine, the screen fades to black with a crash, and fades in during the aftermath with a destroyed floor. When you press a switch, you hear a click as acknowledgement, but you have to backtrack a screen or two to notice that a new path is opened. The world still reacts to your actions, but the limitations of pre-rendered environments means you don't see the result of those actions in real time. On rare occasions you do, and it's to great effect, like when a dragon breaks down the wall of a well and opens a new path. Even when the world isn't changing, you can create immersion with presentation. Conversations occur on the field, and the characters use the space they're afforded. They move around the screen and interact with objects. I strongly believe that adding portraits to dialogue boxes, along with voiced lines, has allowed RPG developers to grow complacent with presentation. You don't need to animate expressive character models when you can just draw an angry face and have the actor raise his voice. I'll spare you the obligatory Persona 5 clip this time, but Atlus is one of the devs that's grown way too comfortable with complacency, and it feels lazy at this point. It's commonplace for RPGs to introduce you to a peaceful town before destroying it, but I enjoy going back to witness the aftermath. Final Fantasy has generally been good about this. 4 has Mist, 6 has the entire world, 7 has Nibelheim, 8 has Trabia Garden, but you don't get to visit it before its destruction. 9 has Lindblum, and while there's not much to do here, this lull in the action gives us an opportunity to stock up on gear. I'm not sure if the equipment system in Final Fantasy IX is innovative. I'm inclined to say it's not. It might be D&D inspired, and computer RPGs from the early 90s probably incorporated a similar mechanic of learning spells from gear, but I can't pinpoint which ones because I haven't played them. The only computer games I played in the 90s were Jumpstart First Grade, Duke Nukem 3D, and Roller Coaster Tycoon, in that order. I was a console gamer for most of my life. So I'll say this, Final Fantasy IX's equipment system popularized this method of ability acquisition in JRPGs. If you haven't played them, Tactics Advance, Tales of Vesperia, and Lost Odyssey used this system to great effect. RPGs are almost universally faced with the issue of vertical equipment progression. You're comparing stats rather than functionality. When a new sword comes along, if the numbers are higher, you equip it, and the gear that it replaces becomes outdated. I don't really care for this type of customization, as the only thing it does is create bloat. In an action game, when you get a new weapon, it's an enormous deal. That weapon comes with a unique moveset, and it sticks with you for the remainder of the game. It's not meant to be replaced. This is horizontal progression. New gear is an option, rather than an upgrade. RPGs usually don't function this way. If you have a sword that deals 5 damage, and one that deals 10, and every other aspect remains identical, would you use the weaker sword? Of course not. There's no meaningful decision being made if the only factor up for consideration are numbers. Yet this type of progression persists to this day. Loot-driven games like Borderlands and Diablo ruin individual equipment identity in favor of stats. Neo functions in a similar way, but the devs had the foresight to outfit each weapon type with rich movesets. The Soul series also does a commendable job of making most weapons viable thanks to properties like swing speed, pierce versus slash, weapon skills, and so on. Final Fantasy IX attempts to address this issue by tying skill acquisition and elemental resistances to gear. This encourages you to keep weaker equipment around, not for the stats, but for the skills. Sure, you can equip Zidane with a hat that boosts strength, but if you're sitting on a few hats that impart useful passives, you'll probably churn through those first. On a replay, if you remember which bosses favor certain elements, you can prepare by equipping gear that absorbs or resists those elements. It's not a perfect system. The gear you acquire later on far outclasses the junk you acquire in Disc 1. Plus, gear imparts stat bonuses when you level up, which means if you want to min-max, you need to keep levels low for most of the game until you get the most powerful gear. But it's an attempt to keep gear relevant for a bit longer than usual. Plus, some of that old gear is repurposed in Synthesis, which puts Final Fantasy IX head over heels above its predecessors. I've seen more than a few people mention that Fossil Rue is the low point of the game. It starts with a chase, kicking the dungeon off with a bang, but it's unfortunately short-lived. You've got some swinging axes to dodge, but they're perfectly synchronized, so you can just hug the wall and dodge every single one. After 3 screens of this, the chase ends. Final Fantasy VIII led with a chase at the start of the game with the spider tank, and it was a much more involved section, which is why it's so memorable. This enemy isn't much of a threat because after a few seconds it falls down a pit, never to be seen again. Having this boss chase you through the entire dungeon would have been so much more exciting. Immediately afterwards, you're confronted by a boss that's on a mission from God to kill Garnet. This is a pretty tough fight if you don't cast Reflect on Garnet or use Vanish from Kuina. In the Sakaguchi era of Final Fantasy, most bosses had some sort of gimmick that encouraged using spells you'd otherwise never use. This circumvented the need to grind. Too many people still believe that older RPGs required grinding. That was true in the 80s, but once we started getting games on the Super Nintendo and PS1, Square scaled back the need to grind. You don't need to brute force any fight, you just need to play smart. The fact that Excalibur 2 requires you to reach the final dungeon in under 12 hours is proof of this. I happen to love this type of gimmicky boss design, and that's a Sakaguchi era trademark. His projects at Mistwalker, Blue Dragon, Lost Odyssey, and Fantasian all employ this classic formula. Once Lonnie's gone, you can backtrack all the way to the start and grab an elixir. Definitely not worth the effort because now random battles appear. But now you reach the dungeon proper, and it's less confusing than it looks. It's difficult to get lost here because the Gargan's paths are all segmented. Switches only affect one path at a time, and usually one path leads to a dead end with treasure, and the other is how you proceed. Switch puzzles were a classic in the genre. There's an action game on the PS1 called Alundra that has some of the most involved switch puzzles I've ever seen, and it pushes them to the point where they become infuriating. Maybe that's why when I replay Fossil Rue, it's child's play by comparison. Right before the dungeon ends, you can whack at a pillar for an hour to get an add-on that's absolutely not worth the effort, and it's missable, so it's now or never. I got pretty lucky and snagged it in 5 minutes, which is all the time I was willing to spend on this. What's really great about the equipment in this game is that even if you think they're pretty useless, or they outlived their usefulness long ago, oftentimes they can be synthesized into something much better. This ring isn't that worthwhile, but it can eventually fuse into a reflect ring, which is worthwhile. Conde Petie? In Japanese it's Conde Apata, so I don't know. This is Final Fantasy IX's version of the Dwarf Village, except instead of saying Lally-ho like in prior games, the residents say Rally-ho. This village is home to two iconic scenes with Kuina, the marriage scene with Vivi, and when he wanders into a shop and tells the owner to Rally-ho himself. You can interpret this scene in one of two ways. Either Kuina is reciprocating the greeting in a playful manner, similar to how someone might respond to hello with hello yourself, or he's telling the shopkeeper to go fuck himself. I imagine he's using it dismissively based on context clues. It's likely that Kuina has had to utter Rally-ho several times before this point, and has gotten sick of the phrase, to the point where the next time he's forced to respond, he does so in a frustrated manner. As he enters the shop, Kuina is facing away from the clerk, which is already quite rude. He walks in and deliberately turns away, never making eye contact until the dwarf finishes his greeting. When he utters Rally-ho yourself, it's a matter-of-fact statement. There's no comma placed after the ho to isolate the greeting, and there's no exclamation point to indicate excitement. He immediately follows this statement by probing the clerk for food, indicating that the only thing he even remotely cares about is if this supremely out of the way from the rest of civilization village has something tasty to make the trip worthwhile. Considering Kuina just went through a dungeon and has hoofed it halfway across a barren continent, and he already consumes far more than anyone else, he's probably teetering on the cusp of starvation, which explains his bluntness here. Not only that, notice how Kuina's speech becomes livelier after he's enticed by the shopkeeper's nuts and berries. This is sarcasm. Either he's interpreting the shopkeeper's response as slang for testicles, which would make this an appropriate retort. Someone comes into your shop and tells you to go fuck yourself, so you tell him to eat your nuts. Or he's offended that such a morsel is the only thing on offer to satiate his appetite. He feigns sympathy when the owner says that the village has been combating a thief, then moseys on over to a pumpkin and gives it a whiff. This is a subtle insult. Pumpkin is slang that an adult uses when speaking with a child, similar to calling a kid cupcake or puddin'. The dwarves' diminutive appearance means that Kuina views them as children, and by sniffing the pumpkin while staring in the owner's eyes, Kuina is telling the owner that he's no better than a child. Unfortunately, Kuina is undermined by his gluttonous tendencies and falters when the clerk offers to sell the pumpkin. Height challenge individuals tend to be quite defensive and sassy to compensate for their lack of vertical body mass, as evident by Joe Pesci in any Martin Scorsese movie. The clerk accuses Kuina of being a thief, and Kuina runs away, knowing his growing starvation would make him weak if this altercation became physical. If you can't tell, not much happens in Conde Petie, but before we move on, I want to address the manner of speaking that the dwarves use. They speak with a Scottish accent, as made abundantly clear by the phonetic spelling used in their dialogue. Not everything about Final Fantasy IX is perfect, and this is one of the few parts that I dislike quite a bit. It's an issue of conveyance. How do you convey a regional dialect without voice acting? Square, during the PS1 days, opted to use phonetic spelling, where instead of spelling the word or as OR, they spell it OOR, because that's how the dwarves pronounce it. When you're reading this, oftentimes you stumble on these phonetically spelled words and need to decode what's being said, which slows your comprehension. When you come across, "I dinna ken what else we can do, lads," you need to spend an extra moment processing this phrase as, "I don't know what else we can do." This would be a minor annoyance for a one-off character, but it's a distraction that persists throughout your stay, and makes the conversations less enjoyable to read. When Chrono Cross was localized, so many characters spoke in bizarre dialects, as if that were the only way the writer could differentiate between the cast. The characterization starts and ends with the way they speak. One replaces the letter W with V, one says cha instead of you, one has a French accent and says oui oui. It's distracting, obnoxious, and a poor excuse for a personality. There are better ways to portray a race without voice acting. Look at Kuina. Does he replace random letters with Q when he speaks? He has a peculiar way of speaking where he omits words, but it's still easy to understand them. The back half of Disc 2 entails a lot of town hopping and talking, and not a lot of dungeon diving. which makes sense considering you've spent most of the runtime kind of aimless. Braun is your enemy, yet you're running away from her. You know little about Kuja other than he's super gay for Zidane, but you don't know what his goal is or even where to find him. So in this calm before the storm, we get to learn a bit more about our party members. Final Fantasy IX is very patient with its approach to character development. It doesn't throw everything in your face right at the start and expect you to care. It gives you time to learn about these characters. Learning that Vivi only has a few months left to live hits much harder after you've grown attached to the little guy. If this was the first thing you learned about him, the impact would be much softer. Timing is an important aspect of storytelling and character development. You want enough mystery to keep playing, but you don't want to wait until the very end to get answers. It sounds obvious to sprinkle development evenly throughout the experience, but if it were that easy, so many JRPGs wouldn't save the bulk of their character development and plot revelations until the final hour. Pacing is something extremely difficult to get right, and I don't know if it can even be done in a way that could be considered right. Slow for me might be tolerable for most people, but every once in a while, I'll play an RPG and get engrossed in the story, and timing might have something to do with it. If the game earned my patience, I can sit through an extended sequence where characters just talk. Eiko is one of the very, very few younger characters in this series that I like, and that's probably because she's rather mature for her age, but not so mature that it erases the innocence of her character. With characters like Hope and Vanille from Final Fantasy XIII, my only motive for completing their focus was seeing them turn to Crystal, so they could shut up for the rest of eternity. Chadley in the 7 Remake series should be dismantled for scrap parts, especially in Rebirth when he and his robot girlfriend ring you up incessantly. In Final Fantasy VI, I always leave Gao's ass on the belt where he belongs, because I can't stand his way of speaking. Eiko isn't a whiny runt that hogs the limelight. She can be helpless at times, but her charming personality keeps her from being annoying. She naturally gets along with everyone. Some of the best kid characters in media are ones that share great chemistry with the rest of the cast, like John Connor in Terminator 2. They're not pointless tag-alongs. In fact, they might even teach the adults a valuable lesson or two. Music-wise, Eiko's got my favorite character theme in the game, and that's saying a whole hell of a lot. Combat-wise, she's got a lot going for her. Her summon pool isn't as large as Garnet's, but some of her summons can be modified depending on the add-ons she has equipped. This is a really cool mechanic that I wish applied to more summons. There's a lot of multifunctionality with items in this game, like how weapons can apply status effects, but you need to equip add status to get use out of them. Certain gear absorbs and resists damage, and the more gems you have in your inventory, the more damage the summons deal. Most of this can be ignored, but it's added depth that makes the game more engaging for challenge runs. Eiko fulfills the white mage role better than a summoner anyway. While in Trance, she can dual cast white magic, and she's the only party member that learns Holy, which is more than worth the price of admission. Granted, she learns it very late, and you can't rely on Trance, but white mages in RPGs generally struggle to stay relevant, so the fact that Eiko can dish out respectable damage at all keeps her ahead of the curve. This is a tangent, but I played Final Fantasy XIV at launch, and at the time, one of the most engaging jobs to play was the white mage. There existed a skill called Cleric Stance, which swapped your intelligence and mind stats, allowing you to spam Holy for respectable damage. The challenge came from stance dancing, knowing when to swap between offense and back to healing, making sure you're not caught with your pants between your legs when Cleric Stance is on cooldown. This additional damage from healers assisted raiding groups in meeting DPS checks, so endgame healers were expected to stance dance. I don't play Final Fantasy XIV anymore, and in the years since, I learned that Cleric Stance was removed. Offensive skills now scale with mind, so white mages can still dish out damage, but without the skill required to stance dance. I imagine casual white mage players were thrilled with this change, and truthfully, it's not a big deal for me because I dislike Final Fantasy XIV and don't see myself ever playing it again. Still, this excessive streamlining and push for accessibility is gradually erasing the depth that I love about video games, but that's a subject outside the scope of this video. When I first played this game, I thought Madain Sari was a boring segment. Lots of talking, not enough action. I've had a short attention span my entire life, so it's a small wonder that I even got into RPGs. But now, I think Madain Sari is one of the better parts of the game. Lots of important character moments happen here. Vivi has an existential crisis, Garnet recovers some of her memories, and perhaps the greatest development of all, Zidane and Vivi have a pissing contest, and they piss so loudly that Eiko can hear them from 100 feet away. Coincidentally, there's a waterfall here, so it's likely that the urine runoff could pollute the local fresh water supply. But if urine is comprised of over 90% water, is it really a significant pollutant? You know, some cultures drink their own urine. Sick cultures, but you know, who am I to judge? I never drank my own piss, and I'm willing to bet you haven't either. So could it really be that nasty? There's actually a documentary called Urine Good Health that extols the health benefits of guzzling gallons of your own piss. One of the people interviewed treated his HIV by drinking a warm glass of his own piss every day. If only we had a time machine so we could tell Freddie Mercury that he had the cure all along. The same people that produced this documentary made another one called A Hole in the Head, which involved people partaking in recreational trepanning, drilling a tiny hole in your forehead. This is supposed to improve mental health, but I mean, there's no way you're gonna be dumber if you're already stupid enough to drill a hole in your head. Eventually, the party settles on visiting the Ifa tree, which I swear was called the Lifa tree, and someone got a hold of every known copy of Final Fantasy IX in existence and patched them to read Ifa tree. Same for the spell Esuna. I called it Ensuna as a kid. Come to think of it, maybe I just never learned to read properly. Your strongest weapons here are items. These tree enemies hold soft, which you can steal and throw back at them for an instant kill. I don't know why they're holding their own kryptonite. The other enemies here are weak to Phoenix Downs and Cure spells, so what should be an exciting conclusion to Disc 2 is ultimately the easiest dungeon yet. Even the boss can be brought down to single-digit health with a Phoenix Down, though I use the life spell since it's even faster. There used to be an obligatory undead boss you could kill with Phoenix Downs in several mainline Final Fantasies. 5 has Tyrannosaur, 6 has the Phantom Train, 7 has Gin Attack, 8 has Gero Gero, aka the alien that disguises himself as the president of Galbadia and slips fake information to the local anti-establishment group that the president is going to be relatively unattended on a train, so the group hatches a scheme to isolate the president's train car while it's hurtling down the tracks at 40 miles per hour by running along the roof and inputting complicated codes to detach the cars without falling to their death or without the guards listening to the sound or feeling the impact of trains detaching and reattaching so they can confront the president in isolation, only to realize it's an alien and the real president is safely at Deling City, the capital of the country that is named after the president himself. And because this overcomplicated plan was a complete failure, they decide plan B is to just kill the sorcerers with a 50 caliber rifle, which is what they should have done from the start, and that sums up roughly 20% of the entire plot of Final Fantasy VIII. And 10 has Evre Altana. Once you reach the base of the tree, you find yourself standing atop what looks to be an enormous harp, whose strings stretch into infinity. Look at the attention to detail here. The metal parts of this structure are heavily corroded from the moisture. You're not going to have any idea what this is the first time you play through this portion, but towards the end of Disc 3, we learn that Garland transplanted the Ifa tree to filter souls, and he did so by installing something called a Soul Divider. The Soul Divider is a filter that catches Gaian souls and lets Terran souls pass through. The Gaian souls stagnate and turn into mist. Some of the most interesting stories in this series revolve around the cycle of souls, the life stream in 7, Fireflies in 10, and Mist in 9. So this harp-like structure is a net, and it draws an interesting parallel to real life. In 2018, students at Virginia Tech created a fog harp to catch water. Doubtless they were Final Fantasy IX fans. Fog nets have been used since ancient times to collect condensation and turn it into potable water. As mist or fog passes through the net, the moisture condenses, and it eventually drips into a clean supply of water. I'm not sure if this served as the inspiration. It's probably explained in an Ultimania that never left Japan, but it's the best reason I can think of for constructing an impossibly large harp. Or maybe Garland just repurposed this giant harp that was played by giant people on his home planet, instead of building a new device to catch souls. If this were Dark Souls, you'd pick up an item that's a piece of this harp, and the description would explain how a giant from antiquity played this harp from atop a mountain, and people would spend 2 hours analyzing this line that was pulled out of someone's ass. Considering I spent an hour analyzing the tutorial stage in Final Fantasy Tactics, who am I to judge? By the way, part 2 of that is still in the works. I spent 3 hours discussing how WeGraph predicted the Kobe Bryant helicopter crash, and how aliens are orchestrating deaths through aircraft quote-unquote malfunctions. The writing was on the wall for so many years, so stay tuned for that. I don't know why, but this brief scene where Eiko hiccups, holding back tears, breaks my heart now that I'm older. I usually can't stand little characters, but it's hard not to sympathize with Eiko. Her family's dead, she lives alone, her family heirloom is missing. The only thing she has left in life are these friends she met a day ago. I think what really sells this moment is the absence of music. You just hear the crashing waterfall in the background. I'd hate to see this scene remade, with melodramatic voice acting and somber music to force an emotion out of you. Our last proper fight of Disc 2 is a one-on-one duel with our soon-to-be least interesting party member, Amarant. Not only does he have little screen time before this point, he barely speaks for the remainder of the game. You could pull him out of the story and practically nothing would change, aside from some fun interactions with Freya. Final Fantasy has had uninteresting optional characters in the past, but Amarant isn't optional, yet he feels just as contrived as the likes of Gogo, a mime you find sitting inside the belly of a giant worm for no discernible reason, and that's his entire story arc. Okay, maybe Amarant isn't that bad, but he's close. By the way, this Magic the Gathering Final Fantasy set is so disappointing. Final Fantasy XII only has 12 cards. Meanwhile, 14 has 45. How is this even remotely balanced? How are there more cards for Final Fantasy III than 12? There's not even a card for each character in 12. Bosch doesn't have his own card. Really wish Wizards of the Coast just made this explicitly a Final Fantasy XIV set so I could skip it entirely. There's no way this is a celebration of the series when a quarter of the cards just belong to Final Fantasy VII and XIV. There was a time when Square's FMVs were the most impressive looking cinematics you could find. They were practically a selling point, with the back of the box for every PS1 Final Fantasy boasting about the visuals. High fidelity visuals are an important part of gaming, and I think anyone arguing otherwise might be a bit misguided. I'm not saying realism is better than stylized graphics, I'm talking about attention to detail. Nobody would say Final Fantasy IX employs a realistic style, yet these cutscenes are still beautiful thanks to the effort that went into animating them. Look at this scene where Kuja wipes blood from his forehead, while his hair sways in the wind and his dragon beats its wings. Who can watch this and say Final Fantasy IX is anything other than beautiful? The reason why Square jumped ship from Nintendo was so they could enhance the most important story beats with FMVs and create memorable moments, and all the space that takes up wouldn't fit on a cartridge. The devs themselves were telling the world that graphics mattered. Their vision couldn't exist on weaker hardware. Where this got out of hand was when Square Pictures produced The Spirits Within. Square spent over $100 million in their pursuit to create one of the most visually impressive 3D animated films. It took an average of 90 minutes to render each frame, times 140,000 frames. Hundreds of artists, of which several dozen animators were dedicated to solely work on facial expressions and hair movement. A collective over 100 years of manpower for a film that was an unmitigated disaster. Graphics are important, but they can't be your only selling point. Beautiful visuals can't excuse a boring story, but they can enhance a story you're already enjoying. Swinging this back to game design, too many developers use one strong component of game design to compensate for a weaker aspect. Final Fantasy XVI has a great combat system, but it's wasted in a game where most of the enemies don't present unique challenges. Forspoken has slick movement, but the world is so barren and devoid of situations where you can make the most of the movement system. I like to think Final Fantasy IX is a well-balanced game with no glaring weak points, but that wouldn't be true now, would it? Disc 3 parallels the start of the first disc, with you getting a glimpse into each party member's private lives. The crew doesn't have a reason to continue their adventure just yet, so the main force splinters away for a trip to Treno, where a Tetramaster tournament is being held. You didn't really think I'd make this video without talking about Tetramaster, did you? This tournament is the perfect segue. For years, I mostly ignored Tetramaster and wrote it off as a terrible game, and largely a downgrade from Triple Triad. But I made a genuine effort to learn the game this time around, and now I can sum up Tetramaster with 2 words. It's okay. Triple Triad was a success because of its casual design. The pictures on the cards are large and vibrant, the numbers on the edges are easy to understand, the rules are simple and clear, there's a collectible aspect with one-of-a-kind cards, but most important of all, it's easy. Within a few hours, you can build a deck that will beat everyone, and the only way the game can trip you up is with regional rules like random and direct. This casual design is very appealing to wide audiences. which is also why Gwent was so successful in The Witcher 3. Buy a handful of powerful cards and you'll quickly steamroll every opponent. The same can be said of Queensblood in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Tetramaster differs in a fundamental way. It's random. The numbers you see on the cards are not absolute values, they're ranges. I think so many people dislike Tetramaster for one simple reason. They don't understand how it works because the game never explains the rules. It's based on a hexadecimal system that really isn't that complicated, but at no point does the game explain that when you duel an adjacent card, each card rolls between a range. The numbers dictate these ranges, and if you're unlucky, a powerful card can still lose to a terrible one. That one loss can result in a cascading effect where the opponent can flip the entire board. This mechanic works both ways. You can salvage a losing game, but so can the opponent. The swing is powerful enough to invalidate most of the skill required in assembling and playing a hand. Modern digital card games like Hearthstone employ this same extreme randomness, which helps casual players eke out victories against pros. And anyone that's played Hearthstone seriously will tell you that losing to bad players is one of the most infuriating feelings imaginable.
But I just lost to the worst player ever.
Someone that's played for thousands of hours can lose to someone playing for a dozen, all because of luck. But that chance that anyone can win also makes for entertaining tournaments. It's for this same reason that modern fighting games incorporate comeback mechanics like supers. One-sided matches are much less interesting to watch. Tetramaster is strictly single player. You're not putting on a show for an audience. The randomness exists not to entertain, but to compensate for poor AI. Tetramaster's design is more complex than Triple Triad's, factoring in arrows and defenses, so instead of coding AI profiles of different competencies, it's easier to add a layer of randomness that gives the opponents a chance to win, no matter the situation. But Triple Triad's weakness is your ability to manipulate the rules and use unique cards to sweep everyone. It reaches a point where winning becomes guaranteed, with the only exception being the Queen of Cards. If Final Fantasy VIII had more opponents like the Queen, Triple Triad would be more entertaining when you replay it, because victory wouldn't be expected. Card games need randomness to force strategy and stay engaging. That's why games like Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh! Impose minimum card limits and force you to draw from a shuffled deck. You can't pick your hand. If you could, then whoever goes first wins every time. See also Queen's Blood. Another reason why people probably dislike Tetramaster has to do with a lack of incentive. Triple Triad's cards are valuable beyond their ability to win the board. They can be refined into magic and items. Your rewards for playing and winning translate to increased strength in battle. The reward is so extreme that a single card, Quistis, completely shatters the difficulty from the very beginning of Disc 1 all the way through to the end. Tetramaster is merely a card game. You play it for sport. Not only do the cards serve no alternative purpose, you can only carry 100 at a time, so even that collectible aspect is neutered. The only point where you receive a tangible reward comes from the tournament, where you can win a rebirth ring, a prize well worth save scumming to win. Including more tournaments with prizes could have been enticing enough to keep players interested, but as it stands, Tetramaster is a poorly explained minigame that's too reliant on luck to be anything more than a brief distraction. Still about 100 billion times better than Blitzball. Disc 3 is primarily about exploration. Exploration in Final Fantasy IX is handled remarkably well because of the incentives it offers. You can collect blue magic for Kuina, you can collect treasures to strengthen your team. Treasure hunting is directly tied to the Chocobo minigame, so let's stop putting this off. Chocobo Hot and Cold frustrates for the same reason as Tetramaster. It's random. When you're lucky and snag the chocograph that you want within a few attempts, it's harmless. But when the desire sensor kicks in, you're spending upwards of an hour mindlessly mashing the same button, praying that this ant-sized treasure spot you've been fumbling to uncover has a chocograph, and not your 600th potion. Unlike Tetramaster, your reward here is your ability to explore the world, fight Ozma, and collect endgame gear. If you dislike Chocobo Hot and Cold, it's not really something you can ignore unless you're on a beeline to finish the game. It took me 2.5 hours to unlock the Ocean Chocobo, and there's only so many times I can listen to Vamo a la Flamenco before I throw on a YouTube playlist. Treasure hunting outside of the forest and cave fares much better. This minigame makes use of the entire world. It feels like a genuine treasure hunt, where you need to pay attention to the environment to pinpoint the treasure spot. Well, except for the ocean chocograph. I can admit that I looked up the location online for this run because my patience grows thinner by the minute. All these conveniences added in modern games, like waypoints and journals that keep track of side quests, they condition you to lower your patience threshold. If you didn't grow up with games from before your time, it might be difficult to get into them. I imagine people born in the past 2 decades will struggle to enjoy games with random battles. Meanwhile, some of my favorite RPGs have random battles. I didn't grow up with old computer RPGs from the 80s, so the thought of playing a game without a map sounds frustrating. Unless that game is Etrian Odyssey and you draw your own in-game rather than busting out a pen and pad. But if you look through message boards, you'll see people share some of their graph paper maps from when they were kids, and I can't help but admire how much more immersive a game can be if it doesn't spoon-feed you everything. It's too late for me to get into these games, but I respect them nonetheless. And at least the ocean chocograph is the only cryptic one of the lot. The rest have more reasonable clues. The ocean one also houses Garnet's ultimate weapon, so the payoff is still rewarding if you put in the legwork to scour the planet. This is also a prime opportunity to tackle some side quests, but I never fancied myself a side quest guy. For me, a worthwhile side activity is exploring an optional dungeon packed with puzzles and bosses, not going on fetch quests for random townsfolk. But therein lies the dilemma. If a developer puts in a great deal of effort in designing a dungeon, would he want that experience to be optional? To be missable? Mandatory activities are usually the best activities because they receive the most polish and attention to detail. They're what everyone has to experience to beat the game. That's not to say all side content is bad. In Xenoblade X, most of the game revolves around optional character missions, and some of those storylines are more entertaining than the main story chapters. You can recruit characters, learn new skills, and fight unique bosses. Compare this to the first Xenoblade, where the overwhelming majority of side quests were so insipid that quest givers would hand you 3 or 4 at a time, most of which entailed killing X number of weak enemies. How much thought do you think went into designing those side quests? I'm harsh on Final Fantasy XV's open world design, but one bit of credit I can give that game is there exists more than a few optional dungeons. Some are pretty lengthy, and there's even a post-game dungeon that's several hours long, and it consists entirely of platforming. Really terrible platforming, but at least it's unique and challenging. This is the kind of side content I want to see in open world RPGs. Not collecting 100 cats or praying at 100 shrines like in Rise of the Ronin. Thoughtless, checklist type content does not constitute engaging gameplay, but it must be the easiest type of content to design because it's found in almost every modern big budget game. For all this talk of video games being difficult to produce and taking 5 years to complete, it's frankly embarrassing that the best developers can come up with are Banjo-Kazooie tier collectibles scattered throughout the world. This is another section where the party splits up, except you have control over assembling the teams this time. The team retrieving the Gulug stone should consist of melee fighters, since you can't cast magic in the upcoming dungeon. It takes a while before Final Fantasy IX hits you with some meaty dungeons, but Disc 3 doesn't disappoint. You're treated to 2 back to back, and a third comes soon after. Going back to how older Final Fantasies were sillier, I miss these creative enemy designs. This enemy is called Armstrong, and it consists of 4 cats supporting a tiny house that fires from a cannon while dropping anchor. Why are the cats doing this? Did they assemble this house? Why are they wandering the desert? Well, sand cats are real creatures. They live in arid locations like the Saharan and Arabian deserts. These barren regions contain relatively little life, which has allowed sand cats to become dominant predators. Cats in general are one of the most damaging invasive species in the world, killing over 1 billion birds each year, so it's not outlandish to see what kind of power they can amass if left unchecked. They had to adapt to survive this harsh environment, filled with cyclopean dragons and magic-casting lizards rocking mohawks and goatees, so teamwork is essential, hence 4 of them wearing house armor. The question isn't why are these cats attacking the party, that's obvious. The real question is where in the hell did they obtain a cannon, and who's loading it between shots? Are the cannonballs magically conjured? That might make sense on the Mist continent, where the cats could theoretically harness the power of mist from the air, but the Forgotten continent is devoid of mist. There is a curtain in the rear, so maybe a fifth cat is hiding in there loading the shots, but without opposable thumbs? Or maybe another creature is helping him out. But that still doesn't explain the canon, nor does it explain how there exists multiple of these contraptions wandering the desert. It's plausible that you can't actually kill this monstrosity, merely incapacitate it long enough to escape, and all these encounters are the same foe, but I don't believe that's the case. Foe is a homonym of faux, the French word meaning false. The English usage of the word is generally reserved for objects that are imitations, or not genuine. In the context of Final Fantasy IX, a faux foe is another way of saying fake enemy, so an enemy that's not a genuine threat, or doesn't exist altogether. Considering the party is wandering the desert, and illusions and mirages are commonplace in these environments, it's likely that this enemy doesn't exist, and is merely a hallucination. Speaking of French, the name of this next location is Oeilvert, which means green eye. I probably butchered that pronunciation, but you know what, it's French, so who cares? I'm just gonna call it Oeilvert. This eye motif becomes more prevalent as you progress through the disc, but I don't know what the significance of green is. I think this place is just named Oeilvert because the Japanese really love France for some reason. There's a term used to refer to the extreme culture shock exhibited by Japanese when they visit Paris and realize that the city is a total dump. It's called Paris Syndrome. I love how this is evidently common enough for psychiatrists to study this phenomenon and coin a dedicated phrase. While we're on the subject, there exists 4 short stories in Final Fantasy Tactics called sound novels. They were never translated into English, and they play out like choose-your-own-adventure stories, where you read a passage, you're presented with several options, and your choice dictates what happens next. One of those sound novels revolves around an assassin named Oeilvert. There's likely no connection, but it's fun to learn about these things. It'd be even more fun if the upcoming Final Fantasy Tactics Remaster finally includes an official localization of these sound novels. But Square didn't mention this in the trailer. They did, however, make it abundantly clear that this remaster will include a horrendous blur filter, a mobile game UI, and quality of life features so even a newborn can complete the game with minimum difficulty. Something peculiar to note is the technological feel of Oeilvert. We were treated with a brief scene involving a UFO early in Disc 3, which felt out of place to say the least, but the holograms here further cement that there's more to this world than you originally thought. Final Fantasy IX sheds most of the sci-fi stylings of 7 and 8, but some of that same DNA lingered, especially as the game nears its end. We never reached a point where we're driving cars or yapping on cell phones, but we do fight an attack helicopter crossed with a boat, armed with a folding blade that stretches out over 30 feet like a bowsprit. Oh, and it's a transformer. While Zidane and his group of merry men are off gallivanting halfway across the world, the scene shifts to a frog on a sneaking mission. I'm pretty terrible at red light green light minigames, especially in Mario Party, so I take no joy in this segment. But the timer is beyond generous, so I like to imagine there's someone worse than me that playtested this segment and was frustrated. After the party is freed, we get to run through my favorite dungeon in the game, the Desert Palace. For me, the best dungeon in any game are the ones that incorporate a layer of puzzle solving or platforming, preferably both, like the Zelda series. Merely running through a maze and fighting enemies isn't exciting enough. Final Fantasy IX doesn't have platforming, but it does utilize gimmicks and puzzle solving to keep the variety high. You're likely using a party of mages here, and one of your goals is to weaken the boss by lighting candles to reveal bloodstones. The first one's a freebie to show you what you're on the hunt for, but the rest are tricky to reach, and require some precise movement to unlock the path leading towards them. The cool thing about this dungeon is you're not required to deactivate any bloodstone to complete it. This is a secondary objective. If you want to make a beeline for the boss, go for it. But not only will the fight be more challenging, you'll be leaving behind all that useful loot that comes from solving these puzzles. Because the game expects you to use mages, there's an enemy that alternates between physical and magical resistances, and the boss of the dungeon casts Reflect on itself, so you can't settle into complacency with spamming your strongest spells. Thoughtful dungeon design stretches beyond just the physical layout. The enemy encounters should tie into the theme. It's for this reason that I don't care for games with randomized environments. A computer can't generate thoughtful level design. I also dislike open world games for similar reasons. That moment-to-moment level design just isn't interesting. I've often been called picky or hard to please, But I don't think the problem is that my standards are too high. I think the issue is that people have become too accustomed to mediocrity. To back this point, I'm gonna bring up an unrelated game. Doubtless people will call this out as an apple and oranges comparison, so consider this another tangent. Look at what happened to Pokemon. Pokemon Platinum is one of my favorite games, and that game is packed with meaty dungeons and gyms that require puzzle solving. Scarlet and Violet is light on cave exploration, the gyms require next to zero brain power to complete, the bad guy headquarters is no longer a dungeon, and Victory Road is outright missing. How can you not include a Victory Road? Is this really a case of being picky, when a series I used to love removed all the things I loved about it? That's why I replay older games. If the industry at large is insistent on moving away from the things I love, I'll just go back and play the games I do enjoy. I replay my favorite Final Fantasies every year, because Square doesn't want to make games like this anymore. Final Fantasy is now a rhythm game, a fighting game, a hunter game, a hack and slash, an MMO, everything but a quality single-player adventure RPG. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth came somewhat close to capturing the magic of the older entries, so I'm still holding out hope that Square can bring the series back from the brink. It's not impossible. Mount Gulug has two memorable things going for it. One, it's a reference to the same dungeon from the very first Final Fantasy, and the theme that plays here is a remix of the original. Final Fantasy IX was Uematsu's last Final Fantasy that he composed entirely solo, which was a Herculean effort. Meanwhile, modern-day Falcom puts 4 composers to work on a single game, and 2 of them are outsourced, so the quality of each track is all over the place. Even though Uematsu's long since left Square and is now semi-retired, we're fortunate that several composers from Square's glory days are still producing music. Uematsu worked on Fantasian, and that soundtrack feels like it's ripped straight out of the PS1 era Final Fantasies. Yoko Shimomura was contracted to rearrange the Live Alive remake from a few years ago, and she outdid herself. I can't share any of those tracks, of course, because they'll instantaneously be smitten by a bolt from beyond, but that's a rare soundtrack where the new music surpasses the original. The other really special part of this dungeon are the dragon attacks. Sometimes you'll just see their shadows pass by, but they'll periodically swoop in and ambush you, and even though these are scripted, they can feel like genuine jump scares at times. Overusing this concept would have gotten old fast, but because it's only used in one dungeon, and towards the end of the game, it's a welcome surprise. Stalkers are one of my favorite enemy types in any game. The PS1 era had a few games with iconic stalker sequences, but they were always scripted. Nemesis in Resident Evil 3 is the most popular example, but there's also the T-Rex in Dino Crisis, and the Ultimate Being in Parasite Eve, which is such a dirty segment it's unbelievable. You need to navigate a maze, and if you make a wrong turn at any point, it's game over and you need to repeat the entire preceding cutscene and boss fight. It's awesome! I respect the sheer girth of the director's balls to put a segment like this in his game. You will never see a modern RPG designed like this. The past several hours were spent with Garnet's voice lost, which meant there was a chance for each of her commands to fail during battle. This is more of that fantastic storytelling told through gameplay that I was talking about earlier. If Garnet losing her voice was something only referenced in cutscenes, you could spend hours dungeon diving and completely forget that this plot development occurred. Because her gameplay performance suffers, it's a fact that's always kept in the back of your mind. When she finally regains her voice, the moment is more impactful because you had to put up with that hardship for a while, and now it's a weight off your shoulders. You can cast all of her awesome summons with impunity, you can freely choose your team, and the world is open without limits. Say goodbye to the last time this series ever let you freely travel the world by airship. Final Fantasy XV had a flying car in the postgame, but it controls like a nightmare. If you don't land perfectly, the car crashes and it's game over. They siphoned every ounce of joy from exploring by sky, so I'm not sure why they even bothered. Felt like a last-minute addition. This is a prime opportunity to gear up for the endgame, which entails 2 things. A trip to Daguerreo to synthesize equipment, and exploiting synthesis to fund my shopping addiction. I resisted abusing the cotton robe trick up until now, opting to sell Phoenix Pinions and Ethers instead, but I was still short. I could equip Millionaire on Kuina and farm monsters for money, but I didn't want to. So exploiting it is. There goes my no cheesing the game run. Ah well. While in Daguerreo, you can rename your characters. If you're over the age of 60, you probably noticed most of my team was named after Happy Days characters, with the exception of Vivi and Steiner. I originally started this run last year to record a small portion for my Final Fantasy VIII video, so I only renamed Zidane. I picked up that run for this video rather than taking 30 minutes to start over, and it took until this point to finally rename them. I'm 100% certain that not having these two characters renamed annoyed someone out there, so apologies if that's you. Amarant can't be used in Ibsen's castle, which is fine. Don't much care for him anyway, but the reason given is you're supposed to be racing him. Thing is, there's no clock, and he always wins, so it doesn't actually feel like a race. Maybe that's the point. Zidane isn't interested in racing him anyway. Amarant's trying to show that teammates slow you down, and Zidane proves the importance of a team when he goes back to rescue Amarant on the way out. This gives a tiny bit of character development for the least entertaining party member, but it feels like too little too late. The castle itself has an Escher-esque design that should make navigation confusing, but the dungeon is too short and it doesn't have enough rooms to disorient you. Some rooms are inverted, and there are a few branching paths, but when you're standing outside, you're staring at a huge imposing castle. This should be a 2-hour dungeon, not 20 minutes. The gimmick here also doesn't impress. Weapon strengths are inverted, meaning the weakest weapons deal the most damage, and your clue is the dagger you find in a chest at the start. Almost every treasure chest here holds trash weapons, which, while useful during your visit, don't feel like valuable treasures. If you've been holding on to those weak weapons from the start of the game, then none of this treasure is worthwhile. But what makes this worse is the Moogle here sells the second weakest equipment in the game anyway, so why go out of your way to nab garbage chests when you can just outfit your main force at the Moogle and be done with it? There's a small puzzle here that I like. Your hint is to go against the flow of time. Time refers to clock, so going against the flow of a clock means to go counterclockwise. It's a simple puzzle, but I like that it feels like a genuine puzzle and forces you to think. That aha moment is what makes puzzles fun. When you're given an oddly shaped item and need to match it with a recess to open a door, like you see in countless games, I don't count those as puzzles. There's no critical thinking required. Before tackling the 4 shrines, I took a detour to grab Bad Breath for Kuina. You're forced to use him for the next boss, and Bad Breath essentially ends the fight before it can even begin. I love how Kuina taunts the boss, saying he's gonna eat him, and you can actually do just that to learn a new blue magic spell. This section is another callback to the 4 fiends from the first Final Fantasy. Disc 3 feels like a reimagining of the first game, and that might be why Sakaguchi views this as his favorite of the series. It's the series coming full circle, revisiting characters and locations from the first entry as a sort of respectful homage. After playing Stranger of Paradise, which served as a prequel to the series, I'm starting to appreciate the first game even more. I wouldn't be opposed to more entries anchoring themselves to the series' beginning. The Final Fantasy brand has become so muddied these days, seems like anything can be a Final Fantasy if Square wills it. It'd be nice to establish some rules for once. We've reached the 11th hour, which means it's time for an enormous plot dump. Some things never change with JRPGs. One of the most celebrated parts of Final Fantasy IX occurs here, where the track You're Not Alone plays. This is where all that character development pays off, and your party gradually comes to Zidane's aid to assist him with a series of tough enemies. Starting with Final Fantasy VII, most of the mainline entries feature a protagonist that originally fights for selfish reasons, then grows into a character that wants to save the world. Final Fantasy IX is an outlier, in that Zidane wants to help people just for the sake of it right from the get-go, with his most memorable phrase being, "You don't need a reason to help people." Across the entire history of fiction, there exist 3 traits the ideal hero must possess. He must be selfless, charming, and powerful. Zidane fits the first 2 criteria, but he's not powerful. What humanizes Zidane is this moment of weakness, where he nearly gives up on life and has an existential crisis that mirrors Vivi's, ironically the character he offered the most advice to. Zidane is still the hero, of course, But throughout these encounters, you learn that it's the strength of the team that carried you this far, not just Zidane. Soloing these enemies with just Zidane would be a tall order, but with friends, the foes fall with ease. Video games can teach you life lessons in ways no other media can, if they properly blend story with gameplay. Children can learn a lot from this scene, and adults can be reminded that they're not alone in this world. There are people that care about them. It's a game people of all ages can enjoy. RPGs, more than any other genre, are armed with tools to take advantage of this medium and create experiences that stick with you forever. When you've played hundreds of RPGs, yeah, your standards go up. That's to be expected. You've seen the best of what this genre offers, which means games that just go through the motions aren't good enough. For all the build-up surrounding Garland, I find it amusing that he's weak to silence, which turns the fight into a guaranteed win. A lot of these endgame bosses either have a crippling status vulnerability, or they focus on a specific element which you can either nullify or absorb with appropriate equipment. Not that you'd know playing blind, but it makes for smooth sailing on a replay. I gave Final Fantasy VIII a lot of flack for its broken junction system and how it catastrophically annihilates the difficulty after just a couple of hours of playtime. But in retrospect, I think I was too harsh on that game. It's likely a new player will find out that you can forge ultimate weapons on Disc 1, and how absurdly powerful the Encounter None ability is. I mean, I figured these out when I played the game for the first time as a kid, and those alone can make the game much easier. But figuring out how to abuse junctioning to the fullest from the opening hours is probably not going to happen. Judging a game harshly for having abusable systems isn't really fair if you can't learn about those systems without either a guide or an experience from replays and experimentation. I oftentimes complain just for the sake of complaining. That's how I get my kicks. But it's never mean-spirited. Making a video is as much for my own amusement as it is to entertain others. But I think it's worthwhile to see my perceived issues from other points of view. Is a new player likely to cast silence on Garland to stop him from spamming flare and stop? Not really. So for him, this could be a threatening hurdle to overcome. It's beneficial to look at games from two angles, the new player's perspective and the experienced players. Some games might be great for that first time playthrough, but a slog on a replay, and vice versa. We're fortunate then that Final Fantasy IX is great regardless of how many times you've played it. But all good things must come to an end. Well, it's time to settle on a final team for the endgame. I usually like using Vivi because half the bosses in Disc 4 are susceptible to sleep, and you can smack them with magic without waking them. Steiner's also a great choice since he hits like a Mack truck, but I tried to switch things up this run instead of relying on favorites, which is why I've been using Eiko and Kuina. Eiko can just spam Holy day and night, so she's awesome. Kuina's mostly there for Mighty Guard, and his Twister hits for a decent chunk, but if you don't put in the legwork to babysit him, he's underwhelming. This is why, earlier in this video, I said I dislike blue mages. They require a disproportionate amount of effort to keep them on par with everyone else. Kuina's best move is Frog Drop, and to power that up to hit for max damage, you've got to catch hundreds of frogs over the course of the game, partaking in that tedious minigame at every opportunity. If you put this off until the end, you get to wait hours for the frogs to respawn, so this was an easy skip. There are two other characters with moves that can be powered up to reach the damage cap in similar ways, Zidane and Freya. Zidane's Thievery requires hundreds of steals, and Freya's Dragon's Crest requires you to kill 100 dragons. Neither of those are enticing activities either. Thing is, even if you don't bother with those moves, Zidane and Freya still hit for consistently high damage and have versatile skills. Without Frog Drop, Kuina's basic attack is unreliable, and most of his spells don't have universal applications. White Wind fell off ages ago, and Mighty Guard is still expensive even with half MP equipped. But no matter what I say, using level 5 Death to farm Grand Dragons makes up for any shortcoming. There was no way Final Fantasy IX could beat the final dungeon of 8, which I still view as one of the best designed dungeons some 20 years after I first played through it. The non-linear progression, handicaps, and puzzle solving means the dungeon has no shortage of intrigue and excitement. Memoria strips all of that excitement away in favor of a linear path with bosses placed at checkpoints. Visually, it's an impressive location, and there are important plot revelations being fed to you even now at the very end. but the dungeon lacks that explorative aspect that I love so much. The best we get is one optional boss, and a few invisible Tetramaster players. I skipped Hades this run, but I sure as hell won his card off a Tetramaster match, which I won courtesy of sheer dumb luck. In 2012, Square Enix published a collection of artwork in a series of books called 25th Memorial Ultimania. This was the first time the public learned that the original final boss for Final Fantasy IX was Hades. This makes sense when you look at parts of his design. The throne and weapon are adorned with eyes. Remember that eye motif from earlier? The Invincible has an eye beneath the hull. There's a city named Green Eye in French. There are eyes plastered all over the walls in Garland's castle. The party ascends into a giant gaping eye in Memoria, and you fight Necron in a floating coliseum with blinking eyes inlaid in the stone. So why the switch to Necron? I'm not sure. Hades symbolizes death, which is a running theme in this game when you consider how many characters question their purpose in life. Maybe confronting and overcoming death would go against that theme. Death is inevitable, and every character comes to accept that fact, so it feels silly to have all that character development amount to actually killing death. Necron represents nothingness, so the final confrontation is a fight to show that life and death have meaning. Even the Black Mages, which are artificial constructs, grow to understand how important the circle of life is, which is why they bury their dead. This is probably looking way into this final boss that comes out of nowhere. This final boss that is somehow easier to fight with one character than a full team. Necron has 4 ATB gauges. One has a fixed pattern, and the other 3 cast random magic. If a party member is at critical health or dead, one of those magic casting gauges will be disabled. If 3 are at critical health or dead, Necron will only have access to his fixed pattern gauge. That fixed gauge has just 3 attacks. Grand Cross, which inflicts random status effects, Neutron Ring, which hits for heavy non-elemental damage, and Blue Shockwave, which drops your HP to 1, but can't kill you. If Necron can't target a character, he will skip over that attack in the queue and move on to the next one. With Freya, if you time her jump just right, Necron will skip Grand Cross and Neutron Ring, and by the time she lands, he'll cast Blue Shockwave 3 more times before you need to jump again. So if your timing is good, this boss can be cheesed. But I didn't go that route. This was a fair and square fight for the proper send-off this game deserves. With Necron gone, we're treated to the perfect ending sequence, and it's framed around Vivi's farewell letter. Each character has a satisfying ending to their arc. Something that's underappreciated about this series was how the endings used to be conclusive. They weren't sequel bait. When you beat a Final Fantasy, that specific story was over. If a game did have a sequel, like 10 or 12, it felt forced because the original ending already wrapped everything up nicely. Even Final Fantasy XIII, which I don't much care for, had a decent ending that was completely mangled by 13-2, which was an utterly pointless sequel that ended with a to-be-continued screen. The beauty of Final Fantasy is that none of the entries need to be connected. This isn't the Trail series. Each game can have its own story. There's no need to drag out a specific entry across multiple sequels to expand upon its universe, like 7 and 13. Use those ideas to make entirely new games. I know people grow attached to characters and want to go on more journeys with them, but a story isn't complete without an ending. I don't get that final sigh of relief. I can't reflect on my journey until the story is over. Vivi's goodbye summarizes my thoughts better than I ever could. He's glad to have gone on this journey and wants to go on many more, but he knows his time is up. Even though he's gone, people's memories of him will live on. I can't imagine a bigger insult to this character than to revive him in a sequel just to appeal to fans, which is exactly what Final Fantasy X-2 did to Tidus, and what the 7 Remake trilogy is doing to Zack and Aerith. How can a player be expected to care about any of these characters if they're in danger of being revived? Death invokes a strong response because it's permanent, or at least it used to be. But if death is transient and the endings are inconclusive, why should I care? I know there are people waiting for the 7 Remake trilogy to end before playing the games, and that's likely because they want to experience a complete story, not a fragmented, meandering mess that's taking close to a decade to finish. This wasn't a problem with RPGs in the 90s, but with modern budgets climbing into the hundreds of millions, developers can't afford to make one-off games anymore. Final Fantasy XV can't just be a game. It needs to be a movie, an anime, a collection of DLC, a book, a demo with an exclusive story, a mobile game, a VR game, a pocket edition, an audio drama, a manga, product placement with Audi, American Express, Coleman, and Cup Noodles. Forgive my cynicism, but there's not a snowball's chance in hell Square Enix expects people to consider their modern games to be works of art. Not when they're flagrant with product placement and cross-media cash grabs like Ever Crisis. I consider the world to be exceptionally lucky that Final Fantasy IX has remained relatively unscathed for 25 years. It's a complete story that respects your time, and I guess even my standards have gone into freefall if that's the criteria I'm using to judge an RPG. And because I'm a complete sucker for happy endings, you better believe I cracked a smile when Zidane finally gets the girl. Oh yeah, there's also blackjack at the end of the credits. Someone got paid to program this and hide it behind a cheat code on the end screen. But I have a theory as to why this is here. In Final Fantasy VI, there's an airship named Blackjack, owned and operated by a gambler named Setzer. Setzer bets his services on a double-headed coin toss. That double-headed coin is owned by Edgar, who has a younger brother named Sabin. Sabin has a unique command named Blitz, where you input button combinations to cast special abilities. Sabin has 8 of these Blitz commands. In Final Fantasy VIII, there aren't unique commands. The only unique aspect of each character comes from their limit breaks. 6 has desperation attacks, which were the prototype for limit breaks, but not quite the same thing. Anyway, Selphie's ultimate limit is called the End, which instantly kills the opponent. So if we make it to the end of Final Fantasy IX, and input a specific Blitz command, we can access Blackjack. This makes sense considering so much of Final Fantasy IX consists of homages to prior entries, but why do you need to enter a specific, seemingly random input to access it? Well, remember when I brought up Will Smith? That's right, his album, Big Willie Style, consists of 17 tracks. The code you need to access Blackjack requires exactly 17 inputs. Throughout your journey in Final Fantasy IX, you'll come across chests filled with random amounts of gil. Each number corresponds to a track on Big Willie Style and the controller input required. How do you turn the numbers into controller inputs? Simple. Assign each button on the controller to a number. When you match the numbers, you'll get a specific controller input, such as R2, and the placement in the code, such as first or third position. Once you acquire all 17 and arrange them, you'll crack the code and can finally access the minigame. And much like Edgar's double-headed coin, the game cheats. You can never win. But hey, it's still better than Blitzball. Whenever I talk about a game I love, I like to highlight that it's not the company that's worthy of praise, but the people behind the project. Companies merely hold an IP. An IP alone is meaningless. For example, let's say a direct sequel to Final Fantasy Tactics were announced. The mere announcement of such a game, without an ounce of footage shown, would be enough to stir the fanbase into a frenzy. But now take into account that Matsuno isn't involved. Ito, the battle programmer, isn't involved. Yoshida isn't the character artist. Sakimoto isn't working on the soundtrack. Without these core developers of the original game involved, would you still be excited for the sequel? I wouldn't. That doesn't necessarily mean the sequel will be bad. New staff are capable of producing great games, at least in theory, but there's no reason to be excited by an unproven team. Final Fantasy IX was created by an experienced team that knows RPGs very well, and that's why it feels like such a polished experience. Sakaguchi is credited as the original story writer, but outside of a very rough draft and several key story beats, he didn't develop most of the scenario. He created the skeleton, but not the flesh. That task was left to Kazuhiko Aoki, who worked as a battle designer for the series during the Super Nintendo era, but didn't make any significant story contributions prior to 9. I think he did a remarkable job with this game, but his only other major projects in this series were directing the first Crystal Chronicles and the Chocobo Mystery Dungeon games, all of which were mediocre spin-offs. He did, however, design the encounter system in Chrono Trigger, where enemies ambush you on the field in scripted locations, which wound up being one of the best features of that game. I would have enjoyed his presence on more mainline entries, but it seems like he was provided an opportunity to direct smaller scale projects where he'd have more freedom to design as he pleased. The director for this game was Hiroyuki Ito, the unsung hero of this series and the man behind all of my favorite entries. He invented the ATB system, was the chief battle director of Final Fantasy VI, took the reins from Matsuno to finish up Final Fantasy XII, and designed the gameplay systems and tactics. That's a hell of a pedigree. You'd imagine someone of this caliber, who's still working at Square Enix, would be given the freedom to take the series in any direction he chooses. I'm not sure if he's burnt out, doesn't want to manage large projects anymore, or if Square management just doesn't want to utilize his skill for whatever reason. There aren't many interviews that explain the situation, so this is likely to remain an unsolved mystery. The chief localization director was Richard Honeywood, known for his monumental effort in localizing Xenogears. I think his work on Xenogears was mediocre, with too many blunt force direct translations that made characters sound stiff. I understand that was a difficult game to localize, but if any game needs a retranslation, it's that one. Thankfully, his efforts helped establish a full-blown localization team for Square, which meant future games would fare much better, Final Fantasy IX included. I made this video to express my love for one of my favorite games, but also to show people that Final Fantasy IX doesn't need a remake. It's still a treat to play through over 25 years after its original release. I won't pretend to understand why people want remakes. Everyone has their reason, just as I have mine for being against them. I made a 90-minute video on why Chrono Trigger doesn't need a remake, and most of those points can be applied towards any game really. Would Final Fantasy IX be beloved by so many fans the world over if it needed to be overhauled with a remake? A masterpiece is eternal. I'd hope the IP holders would have enough respect to leave it be, untarnished and preserved for generations to come. Remakes don't preserve the original work, they attempt to replace it. I hope this video serves as proof that Final Fantasy IX doesn't need to be replaced. It's as close to perfect as you could conceivably get.